Okay, so the broadcast is live. Welcome. Hello to anyone who is watching. Thanks for joining us or for watching this video later. This is about the proposed action at Heathrow with drones for people who want to share any concerns, questions, ideas around it. I'm going to talk more about the purpose of the call in a minute, but that's just the sort of title of the video. Just a few seconds on me. I am really inspired by Extinction Rebellion and have been helping with it in various capacities for some time. Also a filmmaker and run a social enterprise. I wanted to do this call because I recognized that there was a lot of people who felt really strongly about this issue, and in some cases I was feeling like it was creating some degree of division between people who actually share a lot of common vision and passion, who ultimately want a lot of the same thing but feel very strongly and see this contentious sort of action in different ways. And I just wanted people to be able to, I wanted to help people listen to each other more and learn more. And I also think Extinction Rebellion can also learn structurally from this as well, if we have that capacity and interest too. I want to just give like less than a minute on just what is Extinction Rebellion, which is a sort of daunting task, to sort of try and speak on behalf of millions of people. It is, to my knowledge, it's one of the most, possibly the most largest environmental movement in history, certainly in response to the fact that we have higher extinction rates today than we have had in 65 million years. So that is why we are rebelling against human behavior that has contributed to us being in this mass extinction event. 150 species extinct every day. 93 million barrels of oil going into our air, soil and water every day, deforesting a football pitch a second. These kinds of ways of business as usual that are not in alignment with the natural systems upon which we depend for our own survival. So that's just very much my own wording. That's not any sort of official XR wording. I've kind of touched a fair bit, I think, now on this call. Anything else to say? You can add comments on the Google Doc that I set up, and I've gathered a bunch of questions on there from people and sort of concerns and ideas. And anyone who's watching on YouTube can also type into the chat on the side. So as we go through, please feel free to add your questions on there. Okay, I'd love to hand over to you guys, and so you can introduce yourselves. Maybe I connected with you first, Larch, so if you want to introduce yourself maybe, and then hand over to Valerie.
Okay, sure. Yeah, my name is Larch Maxey. I been involved in campaigning against the ecological crisis since for about 33 years, and the climate crisis for 25 years. Took direct action, took a year out of my master's back in 1994 to work full-time on the climate crisis. And so when I came across Extinction Rebellion in August last year, 2018, it was clear to me this is the movement I've been waiting for 25 years, which really brings together the science of social change with the science of climate and ecological breakdown. And so, yeah, I've been working full-time with Extinction Rebellion since last year. And so I'm just realizing there's a bit of background noise. I'm just going to shut this window. Sorry about that. So yeah, I'm aware that there's one of the things we do with Extinction Rebellion is tell the truth and act as if it's real, and I think that is a core to our movement. It's our first demand is tell the truth, and it's also, I think, our personal practice, and as a movement, it's core to our DNA. So for me personally, I've known about the climate crisis for 25 years, but it's only really since coming across Extinction Rebellion that I've been telling the truth and letting it in, feeling the emotional impact of it. And so, yeah, it's a radical practice, and I see that that's, you know, the core of what we're doing. And for then, in terms of our DNA as a movement, it's about how we tell the truth, you know, in terms of the science as well, the social science as well as the climate science. Anyway, I work with the Action Circle in XR UK and increasingly link in international XR groups, because there are 60 now countries around the world with XR groups, with the UK kind of Action Circle, and try to make some of those links and do whatever's needed. But that's kind of the core of my work. And I'm delighted to pass on to Valerie.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm Valerie, and I joined XR, I think about 2.5 months ago. It was after the April uprising. That's actually when I first heard about XR. Prior to that, I think I had, like most people, 3 years ago, I saw Leonardo DiCaprio's documentary Before the Flood. And there were a couple of other really amazing, very powerful documentaries that came out at that time. I sort of talked to friends about sort of forming some kind of organization ourselves, you know, like Grandmas Against Climate Change or something like that, but nobody was interested in joining me. So basically, I just spent a few years sort of feeling completely, deeply upset. And in April, I saw the uprising on television. I went down to the West End to find out what was going on. And I was just completely blown away by the courage and the fact that people were actually finally just saying all the things that I ever wanted to hear and doing it. And but I thought actually initially that XR was perhaps a bit too strong a movement for me, you know, as I'm a grandmother, I'm in my 60s. And but I went to their office, met everybody, including Large, and found them to be actually really sensible, deeply caring, some of the best people I've ever come across in my life. I am totally committed to the struggle that we're in. And I don't know if there's anything else to say, but the main thing is I'm a grandmother and I am grieving for my grandchildren.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Lach. A piece I wish I'd opened with was just for anybody who's watching who's not completely clear. This action would not be an official XR action anymore. It was originally proposed as one, but for various reasons, some of which perhaps we'll go into, it is now going to be an independent group of people who are wanting to do the action. It won't be kind of resourced and officially sort of supported by XR. So anybody who's kind of concerned about that specific element, hopefully that's clear. Okay. Yeah, thank you again for your introductions. All right, so maybe we can go to some of the questions. I think I expect both of you will get a bit a grilling from some people. There's some people who think the idea is amazing, some who think it's completely stupid, and everywhere in between. So one thing that I want to check, I see your hand there, Larch. What I was just going to say is just, yeah, I just want to make sure that I don't know how the call will feel. Hopefully, more than anything, it will feel generative, but maybe there'll be some tensions that are coming up. I don't know, but I just want to ensure that at the beginning, both of you have the opportunity to say what really excites you about this action before there's any chance, I guess, of you feeling like either of you are sort of on the defensive. Yeah, I'd really like to give a bit of space for you to sort of say, you know, like, why this weird and wacky idea? So that's to either of you to take. Or maybe, Larch, you had your hand up. Do you want to say something first?
It was just that, wondering whether we should outline the proposal before we get into the questions. But exactly, I like the way you framed it of what excites us about the proposal. So I mean, I'd love Valerie to go first, and then I can sort of fill in any gaps or whatever. If you're willing to, Valerie, you could say why you feel it's important to be working on this action.
Yes. Firstly, I want to say that, you know, I have never been an activist as such in my life. But in my own way, I guess I have a sort of a rebel spirit. I grew up at a time when rebellion and revolution was normal. That's in the 1960s. Though it seemed like the whole world, everybody was rebelling against all sorts of very important things and trying to change the world. So we had some years of a sort of a stability, some decades. I know that around the world there's always fighting, but I suppose I'm talking about in Europe and so on. Now we've reached a point which is literally the biggest fight of our lives in all history. It's unprecedented. And what I wanted to say is that, you know, what people are trying to do at XR and all environmental activists, you know, this point we're at is so utterly frightening and severe. And nobody's been here before. Nobody has done it so that we can say, oh, we're following, you know, others before and how they did things. We're having to write the blueprint for saving this planet every single day of our lives. And the more people who join in to help write this blueprint, the better for this planet and the human race. This Heathrow pause, I think I spoke to somebody today who's a man who's 75 years old. And he said, you know, Valerie, I've been a good boy all my life. And but a time comes when certain things that are happening, it's just so utterly, it needs such drastic action. He says that you have to cross that barrier, because a barrier where you feel that you have to behave in a certain way. Well, I think that puts it very well. We are crossing that barrier, but we're not trying to harm anybody at all, and we will not harm anybody in flying drones. It's all been set out very, very carefully, to the point that sometimes we even wonder if we will shut down the airport because it's perhaps not that dangerous an action enough, but maybe just psychologically, we hope that, you know, that the Heathrow authorities will be frightened enough to shut down the airport. We're taking this stance because we need to do something really fierce to show how serious we are about, you know, our intentions to change the way the world is run and the decisions that have been made for hundreds, hundreds of years, just so that people can be rich and have fancy cars and nice clothes and, you know, eat in fancy restaurants and go on lots of holidays and things like that. I mean, there is something incredibly grave and serious that we all need to make this change over. And I feel that Heathrow is an opportunity to show the government just how serious we are. And for that, I'm excited. Yes. For that, I'm prepared to go to prison. That's it.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Valerie.
Yes.
That's really powerful. Thank you. Yeah. So I echo a lot of that. I mean, I would say, I would say we're not aiming to frighten anyone. I would say that's, you know, the aim of the action is very much about, in all the things Valerie said, to stepping up. Just to pick up on this thing of tell the truth and act as if it's real, I think one of the things we've failed to do as a movement with Extinction Rebellion so far is to fully honor what that means for the people that are willing to go to prison, for example, that are willing to make that sacrifice. When we first started giving the intro talks before the launch in October, so from, you know, all the summer last year and from the spring and summer forward, we were saying that from the research, we see that the changes needed are probably going to require, based on the evidence, 300 to 500 people willing to go to prison, 3,000 to 5,000 people willing to get arrested in the UK, based on the research. And those are ballpark figures. This isn't exact black and white binary science. It's a social science where you get the 50 years of research into this, and you look at the trends and the patterns, and you know that when you apply them across a population, that you'll give yourself the best chance of getting the kind of results that you're after, which is system change to save our species. And so over 3,000 people have said they're willing to go to prison and we haven't really done any actions yet where they've been given the support and the empowerment to do that. In fact, we've had a few action proposals come up, and those people doing all of that work to prepare those kind of actions and put in that sacrifice of time and their liberty have been held back. So instead of us empowering and supporting them as a movement, we've held them back. And so I think overall, I think as a movement, we've failed so far on that. And so I think that's a conversation we need to have. And I'm very much hoping this call today can be part of that conversation. Like, let's look at that, what's held us back and what we need to do as a movement, because we need to be very, very clear in telling the truth that things are so urgent. We have a matter of months to turn things around. You know, the UN General Secretary said last year, no, 2 years ago, last year, but also based on the science from 2017, that emissions have to start coming down by the end of this year. If they carry on going up, then every month that goes on of accelerating emissions accelerates our chances of extinction as a species and societal collapse. Absolutely, we need to be absolutely clear. The patterns we're on at the moment are societal collapse in the medium term and extinction. So that's what's at stake, and it's urgent. So what do we do about that? We're in rebellion against the government. We're not creating a non-governmental organization that's going to campaign like other ones that already exist. We're trying something different. It's not to say that all of the work that I and others have done for the last 30 years and more isn't vital and valuable work. It really is. But emissions have more than doubled over that time, on my watch, on our watch. So it's just being honest about that. We have to try something different. And what compels me about this action is that it's got a unique opportunity to bring pressure to bear based on the science of needing to have these elements of non-violent, disruptive, respectful and self-sacrificial movement. And this action combines those. So we bring economic pressure to bear in a unique way, because there's a loophole in the UK aviation law which says that if a drone is flown within a 5-kilometer radius of an airport, that they have to shut that airport down and stop flights, even if it's flown an inch above the ground. Now, other countries have different laws which mean that that action isn't possible. They would just go, well, that's not dangerous, so we will carry on with flights. But we've proposed this action, a whole group of people with loads of input from hundreds of people, and refined it so that it's doesn't, as Valerie says, doesn't threaten anyone's life, but it does have the ability to shut the airport down in a unique way. And all of the work that we've done in the last 30 years trying to shut airports down because of climate change and the ecological crisis, we've only ever managed to stop a few flights for a few hours. That's all we've ever achieved. So this action has got a unique opportunity to shut down, Heathrow Airport, which is an internationally significant airport, for potentially weeks, let alone hours or even days. And that alone could be a game changer. That alone could mean that government actually, rather than us carry on shutting Heathrow down, it could actually come to the table and do the right thing and meet our 3 demands. And as everyone knows, our 3 demands are that the government tell the truth, act now, and go beyond politics, that it declare a climate emergency and raise all of its resources to raise the awareness of that, educate the public on it. So it's in the media every night. It's a proper emergency that everyone gets to hear about it, so that we're all on board. There's a sense of common purpose, that we act now and we commit to going 0 carbon by 2025 and halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2025, and that we appoint a citizens assembly of ordinary people like us, that's a citizens assembly on climate and ecological justice, which leads parliament. Those 3 aims, we could see major progress on those 3 aims with this action alone. That's what I see from my observing of the data, like looking at the science of social change and what has worked and the laws that are at play, and looking at what this action can bring to that. So this action terrifies me. What terrifies me the most is that we don't get the significant action to bring emissions down by the end of this year, that they carry on accelerating, and that we face societal collapse, which not only will my children live through, but I will live through, that probably everyone on this call will live through. It's like societal collapse coming soon if we don't bring emissions down. Have a look at Jen Bendel's deep adaptation paper. have a look at the science. You know, we're probably all on this call because to some extent we get it, but the practice of telling the truth and acting on it as if it's real isn't something you ever get. It's not a box you can tick. It's a constant daily practice of letting the truth in, looking at those little parts of us all that are in denial. I've connected with my climate denier through this practice. For 25 years, I've known the crisis. It's been the most important thing in my life. But it's only since coming across Extinction Rebellion and this practice of telling the truth and acting as if it's real that I've daily explored what that really means for me, and the emotions and the impacts and the stripping away the elements of denial and opening up. So when this action first came up as an idea, it terrified me, and I was like, well, we can't do that, obviously. And that was, I think, the reaction of everyone when we were talking about it. But then we worked it through, and I believe wholeheartedly now we're in a position where it's personally my moral responsibility to do whatever I can. This is an absolutely vital tool that we have in our toolbox at a time when we need all the tools we can use. It is I believe it's a non-violent action that we have the opportunity to use in a unique way to bring pressure to bear. And we can talk more. I know that some people consider this action isn't non-violent, so we can talk more about that. Should I go into detail about the action now, Luke, or should we just leave that with questions, or what's your sense?
Yeah, I'm gonna hand back to you in just a second. I think I would just like to bring one piece of my own into this, with full acknowledgement that we're covering so much ground already so fast, and so many intense feelings and huge theories and worldviews. I think it is going to realistically be impossible to do justice to kind of responding as much as each one of these deserves. So I'm kind of going to just try and find a balance between bringing in people's contributions and questions to this, even if I'm just kind of moving on quickly from huge things that are being shared. So thank you again. The personal piece I want to bring in is just around, I personally feel like I have a lot of time for people on all sides of this conversation. I feel like there's, as I say, a lot of learning opportunity in it, and I think it's really important to hear different voices when we're trying to work together to create social change. I would say, however, I have a lot less time for people who have not actually looked at the full proposal, and I'm aware of how much work has gone into the legal briefing, into the action design, how it relates, or how certainly some people feel like it very much relates to the theory of change or that research that's based upon. And for me, it's deeply frustrating. And this is regardless of my own opinion, whether the action itself is a good or bad idea. I just think at least clear yourself up on the work that's been done about it. I'm just aware that there's just some people who have, kind of knee-jerk reaction, like, terrible idea. And maybe they would keep that opinion. But I think, I've also seen a lot of people who've found it very useful to just, clue up about the whole proposal. And that is available. It's in the document that I imagine everybody has found this video call in. So if you haven't spotted that, just scroll down onto page 2. There's a link to the proposal and the legal briefing. Okay. So yeah, I think I'd like to hand back to you guys regarding, I think first, the non-violent sort of challenge is a really common one, isn't it? How is this possibly non-violent? Surely this is a threat. It's dangerous. That's why there's this law to not fly drones anywhere near an airport. There's an implied threat here of, how is this non-violent?
Shall I address that, Valerie, or would you like to?
Oh, I thought you were putting it out to. Okay. How is it non-violent? Oh, that's your question. Okay. Hello. Well, I genuinely believe it is non-violent.
So just 1 second, Valerie. Sorry, I'll hand straight back to you. I just want to acknowledge that Dave has joined us. Hello, Dave.
Hello, Dave. Hello, Dave.
One of the people I shared the link to join with a webcam. So I'll bring you in a moment to say hi, Dave, if you're happy just sitting there for the minute. Mm-hmm. Okay, back to you, Valerie. Sorry.
Right. Hi, Dave. Yes, from the time I've joined XR, I've had been in meetings about the Heathrow pause. I know that the non-violent aspect of it has been the main discussion for everybody. It's been designed, as has been explained, the toy drones, which anybody can buy anywhere and fly, are just being flown 6 foot high. So that's just a little bit taller than most people, just above our heads. Also, it's 4.5 miles away from the flight path. And that's it really. It can't harm anyone, any flights. It won't be near any aeroplanes. And furthermore, and fingers crossed, that by announcing this action, they will shut down the airport. So that also cancels out any chance of anything going, wrong in that way. But the point is that the actual action is designed, even if there is a plane flying, not to go anywhere near a flight. It's just that, as Larch said, there is the law that, if a drone is flown anywhere remotely near an airport, the airport has to be shut down. So I don't know how. Yeah, that is something that we have concerned ourselves about hugely, to the point where, as I said, I think that it has been mentioned at times that maybe they won't even shut down the airport, except for the technical legal aspect of it, because it's so undangerous that they might just say, well, forget that, they're not, there's no harm, so we're just going to go ahead as usual because we're safe. And they are safe, but we hope they don't feel so safe. Yeah.
Shall I speak to the non-violence question as well? Yeah. Okay. So first of all, there's the context of the climate emergency, and the fact that every single day over 1,000 people will die today, on average, because of climate change. So there's this, and as you mentioned before, up to 200 species going extinct every single day. So there's the violence of what's happening out there in the real world every single day, people dying because of this crisis. So for me, I hold that very closely. Every day, I'm focused on how I spend every moment of every day, acutely aware of that. So on the context of that, when 15% of British people make 70% of all flights, then to propose to expand Heathrow, in the context of the UK Parliament having declared this climate and ecological emergency, that I think that there's a certain inherent violence to that. We know that decision will lead to more people dying. We know it will lead to more species extinction. So I think that's the starting point in terms of non-violence, that a practice which deeply challenges that is vital. And we know that, as I said before, the movement has to have these 4 elements, and non-violence is the starting point. So I'd say it's crucial that we ask this question, and it's great that people are saying, oh, how is this non-violence? So the second thing, before I get into the details of the design, which Valerie's touched upon, is that there is no inherent violence or non-violence about a drone. So a drone is a piece of technology like a knife or a car that can be used in a whole range of ways. So we drive in cars to get to our actions. We fly drones over some of our actions to get footage. They're not inherently violent tools, but they are pieces of, they're artifacts that can be used in a range of ways. So a drone is the same. It can be used in many, many different ways. As Valerie mentioned, it can be a toy used by children. My son had one when he was younger. And of course, we acknowledge that they are also used as weapons, but that doesn't mean that a drone per se is a violent thing, and using a drone is a violent thing. When a child plays with a drone, it's not a violent act. When we flew the drones over Waterloo Bridge to get the footage of the Garden Bridge, it wasn't a violent act. So I really encourage people to see this action in that context. And so then we've got 9 safety protocols. So with every Extinction Rebellion action, and very, again, just to really emphasize, this isn't an Extinction Rebellion action now. This is an independent action that has been proposed within Extinction Rebellion, but the outcome of that process of taking on feedback is that the sense within the wider Extinction Rebellion system is that Extinction Rebellion UK isn't ready to support this action at this time. That's my understanding of the outcome of that process. And so this action has very much been inspired by Extinction Rebellion. And I feel that, as Luke said, and I really appreciate Luke coordinating this call, that there's a great bit of learning to be had here. One of our principles and values is that we value reflecting and learning. And partly why I'm keen to be on this call and having these conversations ongoingly is because it's how we reflect and learn and improve what we do. If we're going to, to be successful, to try and save our species and all that we love, we have to reflect and learn and make everything we do as good as it can possibly be at every stage. No one will make mistakes, and knowing that good enough is good enough. We don't have to wait for perfection, but we have to have that openness and honesty to learn constantly. So this proposal has been revised and has now got, so in addition to the action consensus that Extinction Rebellion brings to every action, so every action with Extinction Rebellion, like with the April Rebellion, it's non-violent. In order to be on the action and be part of Extinction Rebellion, it has to be non-violent, no alcohol and drugs, that we take personal responsibility for our actions, so we don't cause criminal damage and then run away. We don't try and hide from who we are, and we take responsibility, and that we're respectful in how we speak to everyone. Those basic action consensuses, we're adding to that with this action because of the nature of the action and the concerns that it raised and the incredible valuable feedback we've had. So we've got, in addition to that, we've got these 9 safety protocols to keep it safe. So as Valerie mentioned, one of them is that it's head height. So drones will only ever be flown at head height or below, whereas the legal limit for flying, it recognizes that 400 feet and above is dangerous. So compare with what the law says, 400 feet is dangerous, and we're talking about 6 feet or below. So it's clearly safe from that height perspective. Also, there's a size issue in the legislation. It deems that 7 kilograms before fuel could be hazardous. So drones above that weight could be dangerous, and so have different legislation on them. Ours, we're talking about lightweight, small drones, so they're clearly not in the realm of dangerous according to the legislation. Then we won't fly any drones at all within flight paths as an extra safety precaution. Now, the reality is a 6-foot small drone in a flight path would not be dangerous, but we're not going to do it anyway, just as an extra safety precaution. The fourth one is that we will give an hour's notice before any drone is flown on our action. So before, we will ring up the authorities and say, we're about to fly a drone in an hour. So there's an extra safety precaution there. We will start, the fifth one is we will start all drone flying before any flight starts at Heathrow. So there won't be a case of planes in the air and then drones in the air. That won't happen. There'll be no planes in the air. There'll be drones flying with having had an hour's warning, and there'll be no planes in the air. And then we will, so then they will know that this legislation, which is a sledgehammer to crack a nut, this legislation, it's like absolutely over the top. So it's saying no drone can be flown within this 5-kilometer exclusion zone around the airport. So according to that legislation, no planes can be flown. So they won't be flying any planes. And so we start well before any night flights or scheduled flights. So we start really early in the morning. We will also ring the police once the once that flight is completed, so that anyone that's flown a drone will wait to be arrested. We'll also be flying it at regular intervals throughout the day. Teams, like an affinity group, will be working together so that there's 2 people flying at one time with witnesses and people recording it. They'll wait to get arrested, and then there'll be another team starting. So there'll be continuous flights throughout the day, so that at no point will the airport be tempted to try and squeeze a flight in. Because so there's it's just very clear that we're flying our drones. The legislation has been triggered. It's not safe to fly, so they won't fly. According to the legislation, it's not permissible to fly, so they won't be flying aircraft. They also will have a hotline to the authorities, so that if there is any sort of emergency on the day, So it could be a kind of weather-related incident or any kind of incident that happens. So the classic one that we get asked about is, what if someone tries to co-opt the action and fly a drone dangerously? Well, there's always a risk of this kind of thing on our actions. That's partly why we have the action consensus, partly why we liaise with the police, so that they know if there's anything that's violent done on our actions, it's nothing to do with Extinction Rebellion. So in this instant, in this example, if someone were to fly a drone in a dangerous way, above head height, a larger drone, whatever, a drone in a flight path, if any of those things happen that could be dangerous, that the authorities will ring us and we will stop all of our drone flights for the day to ensure that they can then deal with whatever incident arises. It could be a extreme weather event. It could be a terrorist threat. It could be anything. Whatever incident happens on the day, they've got the ability to ring us and we will cancel all flights. Now, this is a little bit like us doing a swarming or a roadblock and an emergency service needs to get through. So there's always a risk that the police could call our bluff and tell us there's a blue light coming when there isn't. But it's not in their interest to do so, because if they cry wolf, then we'll be more resistant to doing it next time, and they know that. And so we all want to work together for optimal safety, as part of our non-violent practice. And the same will hold with this action. So the emergency services would have the same disincentive to abuse that power in this case as they would any other of our actions. So if they were to say, there's this dodgy thing happening, you've got to stop flights, then we would stop flights. And if it turned out that that dodgy thing wasn't happening, then we would be less trustful next time. So they would not be likely to do that. And that's been our experience so far. They haven't abused that power overall. And that's what we would look to see, because there's nothing to stop us coming back the next day anyway. Just like with swarming, we can come off the road and let a blue light through. With this action design, we can stop flying that day and reconvene the next day. And then the last of the 9 safety protocols is 2 months advance. Well, it says in the original proposal it was 2 months advance notice, but because it's taken so long to keep pausing this proposal and holding it back to really try and take as much feedback in as we could and tweak the action as much as we could, we're now left with about just over 6 weeks notice. But our advice from the industry is that's more than enough for the authorities to put in place any kind of measures they need to. So 6 weeks notice, so a large chunk of time advance notice to in terms of safety, that allows the authorities to make those changes and put things in place. In terms of passengers, longer would have been better. People would have had longer to rearrange their flights. But let's remember, this action has never been proposed to happen in holiday season. It's only ever been proposed to happen outside of that. And we know that most flights are business flights and multiple flyer flights. As we said before, 15% of people in the UK do 70% of all flights. But that, in a nutshell, those are the 9 safety protocols, and those are some of our thinking around why this is a non-violent action. I think that's...
Thank you. Wonderful. Can I just ask Dave a question now?
Please. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, maybe, Luke, you are going to ask him anyway, but how do you feel now, Dave?
Okay, so I guess what I would say in response to that is that well, firstly, thank you for putting this on, and really appreciate having this conversation. I'm completely content that what you've put together in your proposal is safe. I don't see it as being a dangerous action. I don't think that's really what I'm getting at by saying that it's, in my view, not non-violent, because non-violence is about perception, and it's all about perception. So, for example, if I was to call in a bomb threat, even if there was no bomb, that in itself would be a violent action. But it's not dangerous because there is no credible, there's not actually anything there that could cause a loss of life or anything like that. Considering drones to be like toys, I had a toy gun when I was younger. But walking around brandishing a gun, even if it's not loaded, that's perfectly safe, but it's not non-violent. So my main concern with drones, and it's not about closing down the airport or anything like that, is about how drones are going to be perceived in the future. And in the future, I mean in the next year or two, where they are increasingly going to be used as weapons, to the point where they're going to revolutionize war as we know it, not just between state players, but also terrorists, lone wolves, people like that. So people are going to increasingly become frightened of drones and the potential they have to cause harm. And so if we do this action now, or if an independent group does this action now, perhaps it will not be received well. Okay, fine. In a year or two from now, when someone brings down an airliner using a small drone, people are going to look back and they're going to feel very differently about the whole thing. You know, it's going to be so much easier to brand our movement or movements affiliated with it as being terrorists once terrorists start using these weapons in the future. So that's my major concern.
Okay, thank you for that, Dave. Yeah, I'd like to hand over to Larch and Valerie to touch on that. I really appreciate that going deeper into non-violence. Also understanding there to be an assumption in there that terrorists will use drones to bring down aircraft. I don't know how likely that is, but just recognizing there's an assumption in there, maybe it's very likely. But yeah, please, Larch and Valerie.
I just wanted to say, Dave, that what Larch very carefully pointed out is that it's that loophole, you know, in the legislation. That's what we're manipulating, let's say. It gives us the chance to use these drones in a very, very safe way. It's only that loophole which has already been set out by the airport authorities. I don't think it's the same as threatening, you know, with a bomb. This is sort of a scare factor, but this is the drone is a more of a technical action. It's not. The airport knows that there's not going to be any harm, but they can't afford to take a risk because that is already what they have set out about any drones coming near the airport. So it's only that we are manipulating and using maybe that weakness in their legislation. That's all. I think it makes a difference. Maybe I'm not explaining it well enough, but.
No, I think you are. I think, and I do.
I just wanted to say, sorry to cut you, that, we are just trying to find our way through this unbelievable terror that we're facing. I think that, as I said before, that you have to cross barriers. Whatever were the ways that we thought before, we can't so much hang on to them because governments and corporations have totally misused the world and committed a crime against humanity, which they're getting away with. We are trying to do something as radical as we can do, which is safe for people. That is the point. It is safe. But if we can shut down the airport, then we are winning. We are succeeding, but we're not harming anybody. And the harm is to us, you know, flying drones, getting arrested. That's where the violence perhaps will be.
Can I bridge what I think is the difference between what we're talking about here, or the sort of key question I think is around the public perception, and tell me if this is really burning and frustrating and feels like missing the treasure in the conversation here. But I think it's something around the logic and the theory of change, and like once you've really looked at it and thought about it, this does make sense as an action, versus the potentially irrational general public and how in reality it's likely to be perceived by the general public, even if we think that's silly. And so yeah, I wonder if we can explore that more and maybe sneakily bolt on another question that I've got in the document, which is you know, how popular should actions, I mean, maybe let's say by XR or independent groups, maybe it's the same, I suppose, if they're operating to the best of their knowledge within those 10 principles, as I believe this independent action group would be, you know, what is the minimum viable sort of level of public support? I assume, but I'd like to test this, if sort of somehow magically we knew that 95% of the public would be like, oh my God, this is terrorism, this is, whatever you say, this is violent, etc., it probably wouldn't go ahead. I don't know that, tell me. And then finally, also within, this is maybe a slightly separate question, so if you need to park this, tell me, but for me it's quite connected, is how much popularity should it have within the actual activist group itself, be that XR or an independent group that tries to follow the same demands? That's quite a lot. Is that all right to bring in and hand over to you, maybe Larch, if you are ready to take that?
I can have a go at that. So I think it's I mean, I really appreciate everyone's input in here. And what I'm loving about this conversation is these are the conversations that will enrich and empower our movement when we have done the work of processing our emotional reactions, and then we bring the gems of what our feedback is, so that we're not dumping emotionally onto people and blaming and shaming. That's why one of our principles and values is we avoid blaming and shaming. So I'm really appreciating this conversation. Yeah, so in terms of the public, I think, yeah, there's a few things here. One is that just to acknowledge these four things that we know we have to include in our movement is non-violent, disruptive, respectful, and self-sacrificial. They're so easy to say, but the disruptive bit, it's such an easy word to say, but it's like, actually, we need to build such a robust, resilient movement in order to deliver that disruption successfully. We need to be personally resilient, and we need to be resilient as a movement, because what that disruption means is that we will be challenging the system and challenging people, and that we will therefore also get challenged. I mean, we know whenever you put your head above the parapet and stand for something, people will have a go at you. And so I just, it's important to remember things like that. Martin Luther King in 1963 was one of the least popular men in America. By 1968, he was seen as, a hero. He has a national holiday in his name now. So all of these movements we look back on, like Gandhi and others, we look back on them, and of course we see them in the light of history as these incredible beings that were bringing what was needed in the world. And we can so easily forget how hated and despised and opposed and resisted they were at the time, and how challenging that would have been for them and for those working with them and for the movements involved. It's really important that we unpick this disruption and see that it includes all of this. Gandhi was labeled a terrorist. Martin Luther King was labeled a terrorist. We know that in order to cause the disruption that is needed, no one wants to disrupt, but it's needed at this time, because that's the option we have in front of us. We've got a limited range of options, and we've tried for 30 years many options that seem like they might work, and they haven't. So now we have to try different things based on the best science we've got of social change. So that will involve being unpopular, and we have to somehow kind of work out how we relate to that, as for Extinction Rebellion UK and Extinction Rebellion in other countries, and as well as local groups and as individuals. It's like, where does that draw the line? And I hear a lot of people quoting this figure of 3.5% from Erica Chenoweth's work, and I think it's really important that we just unpick that a little bit. So this is often used of like, so the beauty of Erica, I mean, Erica's work's contributed to this field massively. So I've got absolute respect for Erica and her work. It's fantastic. And this figure is really helpful, and in it shows we don't need everyone. So part of the myth that we have to work through is this idea that 30 years we've been saying, and some NGOs still have the slogan like, climate change affects everyone, so we need everyone. And it's like, well, on some level, yes. And actually, for social change and for the urgency of the crisis, we know that we don't. We know that actually movements, when they generate enough people in a capital city for long enough, causing enough disruption in a non-violent way that's self-sacrificial and respectful, that it can be a lot less than that. And so we've shown that with April in the UK, that actually having people that are highly trained in non-violent discipline and working through and trained in self-sacrifice, actually trained in working through the fear that we're all socialized into around arrest and imprisonment. That when people are trained in those things, that actually a lot less than 3.5% is usually needed. And in our case specifically, nothing, as Valerie said, we are writing the blueprint for this exact kind of work that we're doing right now. We can draw on social movements and the work of Gene Sharp and others that are quite different, but there's a load of lessons that we can apply, and we are applying them, but they are different to what we're talking about right now. And so we can only go on best guesses, and it's really important that we go on informed best guesses, and that to my reading of the literature and of the examples and of our own case studies, as each time we do an action we learn more, is that, you know, we can bring about system change with, you know, probably 20,000 people that were like sufficiently committed to self-sacrifice and non-violence, you know, in London in October potentially, and potentially with this. I think these two actions go together really well, which is the Heathrow pause and then October rebellion, because we know cumulative pressure is what's needed, and that Heathrow can bring in a unique, that level of pressure has not been brought to bear on a government in the way that we would be bringing it to bear, and then straight onto the October rebellion can do it. So I think what we saw in April was that people on the left and people on the right equally were behind that action. And so what is happening now is that the cat is out the bag in terms of the crisis. The government has declared a climate and ecological emergency. Parliament has declared it. A number of countries around the world have declared it. The weather is demonstrating it daily. Now, the news isn't yet telling the truth. The government isn't yet telling the truth. Most of us aren't yet telling the truth. And that's always, as I said earlier, it's not a fixed thing. It's an ongoing process. But on some level, we know the truth now. The truth is out. And so as we cause disruption, people increasingly get it. And we're seeing this. You know, the first time we did swarming, people said, don't do swarming. It will ruin us as a movement. But on the third day of swarming in November, taxi drivers who'd been the most kind of challenging group the first day, some taxi drivers saying, I get why you're doing this. And that blew me away, because that's what we're seeing, people starting to get it. So I think when we're talking about popularity, we have to just use our best informed decision. Of course, we want to bring people with us, and we want to build a mass movement, and we want to be open. And what's key is that we do the work so that we're open in our meetings, we're inclusive, we're inviting people, we're constantly, you know, empowering people to step up, especially those with bigger barriers. But yeah, that it's not a fixed thing. It's not like you need 3.5% or we're doomed. It's like, actually, and we can't afford to not do our contribution as a movement, because we're self-censoring because of fear around what may or may not be popular. So just the last thing before I see Valerie wants to speak. So for example, you know, I read the transcript of the interview with a rebel and Erica Chenoweth at the start of the rebellion, where Erica was saying very clearly, you're not ready, as my reading of this is, you're not ready as a movement yet to go for the disruptive phase. You're in your movement building phase. And what we saw in April was that it was our biggest movement building period yet. So our most disruptive action was our most movement building. We've got more people joining, more people jumping on board, we've got more donations, all of those metrics we saw. So it's not a black and white thing. I think we've seen that clearly through a lot of our actions, is that actions that are because there's a certain integrity when we're saying it's an emergency and we're saying tell the truth and act if it's real. If we do inappropriate actions, like, you know, if we limit what we do to what we think might maintain a level of popularity, we're actually going to reduce the ability for us to grow as a movement. Because as people see, and I've had this within the feedback, this has absolutely been clearly sent to me as feedback, is like, if you guys don't do this action now, you're going to look stupid. You know, like, are you just all talk, or are you going to follow through on what you're talking about? You know, people have been saying that. And I understand that not everyone gets to hear those voices, but those voices exist. And I think they also need to be heard and brought into the conversation. Sorry, Valerie.
Yes, thank you, Raj. What I want to add is that what is also really moving and very, very beautiful is the fact that a lot of people who are coming on board with the Heathrow pause are people in their 60s and some people in their 70s. They're not doing this because they're just wild and rebellious per se. They've never done anything bad in their lives, never broken the law. But because of what we're facing, as I said before, they're prepared to step over certain barriers. And I don't mean a barrier to hurt anybody, but to go to prison, to do something pretty radical. And that's just because they don't see any other way. Something has to be done. And so, yeah, I mean, support would be great. It would really help a lot, of course. Well, something, yeah, just going back again, with that, it's just this business about the loophole in the legislation. So, we are just using that to shut down the airport, hopefully. We might not succeed, but hopefully.
Might just come in?
Sorry, was that you, Dave? Did you?
Yeah, if possible. I've heard some technical arguments, some of which stand up to scrutiny. That's great. I don't know if I've heard anything that addresses what I believe will be the widespread perception that this is not a non-violent action. And I don't think we know, because we haven't done the work to survey the public or the XR membership, how many people will put us into the camps of terrorists all the way through to heroes. And that worries me.
Okay, so
can I can I add another thing for you to respond to, just to make your job even harder there, Larch and Valerie? Just there's a little question. I mean, I say little, I think just because I've heard you respond to it before, just about why specifically drones. And I just thought maybe this might fit in with what you're about to say. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So, I mean, Valerie just answered the question of why specifically drones. If we could use kites, we would use kites. The legislation says if a drone is flown within this exclusion zone, then they will stop. They will stop flights. So that gives us an opportunity that we don't have otherwise. So if we don't use drones, we don't get that opportunity. Now, normally following the rules of society, the law exists, so you obey it. But with civil disobedience, as we all know, that involves breaking the law. So in this case, a law is presented to us, which we can break safely without jeopardizing any living being, which will potentially, will certainly, the way we've designed the action, lead to arrest and potentially lead to prison. So that's why drones, basically. If we could use kites, absolutely. Personally, I would much be more, rather use a kite. I can make it myself. It's wind powered, etc. However, people have said about the carbon footprint of drones and that sort of thing. I think, drones, you've got a rechargeable battery. It's not much. It's less impact in a drone than a mobile phone because of the metals going into it. So it's, we're at a crisis where personal changes that we can make to our lives are not going to be enough. We know that we need system change, and I'm always encouraging people to prioritize system change above personal lifestyle choices. And it's not to say that we can't make personal lifestyle choices, but if they're getting in the way of us making effective system change, then that's a problem for me. Like as Chris Hedges said when I met him giving a talk not so long ago, liberal co-option is the biggest threat we face as a movement. And that liberal co-option includes our internal voices, includes the conversations we have within our movement, and includes the forces bearing on us from outside of our movement. So that's something to be consciously aware of, and also bringing explicitly into the conversation. So in terms of your point about surveying, so it's an absolutely reasonable point. I would say we've never done that before with Extinction Rebellion. I've been in a very interesting conversation in this last week on Facebook in a private message with a woman. She's a mother of 3 kids, single parent with mental health problems, working class woman. And she wrote to me sort of because she wanted a bit of a rant because she was pissed off when she saw me on Sky News. And I initially was going to block her, but I was like, no, I'm really open to learning here. This woman has got a perspective that I need to hear. So, and we've just, I'm getting emotional. We've just had a beautiful connection in the last week. And it started off with someone that wanted to rant at me, you know, and I was very clear I wasn't going to be ranted at, but I wanted to hear the value that she had to bring. And what it, you know, we haven't finished the conversation by a long way, but what I've got so far from it is that fundamentally, she actually didn't have a particular problem with me in the interview, although that was the target initially. It was the fact that a movement that was doing this disruption, and how it was portrayed in the media, you know, of these great unwashed, as she called us. You know, I made a point of saying I actually washed before my Sky interview and I wore a suit. So I said, well, what could I have done differently? And she's like, actually, no, it wasn't that. It wasn't. It's not you, because now we have a connection, and I think we have a deep respect for each other. But it was her perception. So I just want to mention this because, you know, everything we've done with Extinction Rebellion pretty much has had a risk of alienating some people. The name Extinction Rebellion was very, very challenging, and lots of people said you cannot call it that. Using the logo, some people still see that as a violent thing and it puts them off. But we know overall the name Extinction Rebellion and the choice of the logo have been absolutely amazing and key to people, you know, what we've created. Similarly with the bridges action and the swarming and the blood of our children, each of these things that we've done that's been each time a vital part of our movement and success have alienated some people and have brought from other people a fear of alienation, like projecting what may happen. And all of those voices are really important to hear, and I think by hearing them we are a stronger, better, more informed movement. But they haven't stopped us doing it. So the actions that we've done to date have turned some people off, and what we've seen that overall is that we've grown. Now, there is potentially an argument to say that this Heathrow action is of a different kind, so it requires a different treatment to all of our actions to date. But what I do see a pattern that, you know, with all of our actions, or many of our actions, of like some people saying this is going to be the ruin of us, and then us doing it, and the fear of what it would be like was always a lot worse than the reality. And with the drones, we're talking about, and you know, so there's a whole creative input that's been kind of wanting to get unleashed in this action, but it's been held back because it's just been a proposal. We haven't got a clear go ahead. So there's like a whole creative teams wanting to get stuck into this action, and things they've been talking about, which are just ideas and will come through once they're empowered to, is, you know, ideas, for example, of children naming and designing the drones and decorating them, of pink drones, of, you know, there's all sorts of, and actually really taking the drone and reclaiming the image of the drone and the nature of the drone, redefining what a drone is, and kind of like claiming it as the David against the Goliath of the aviation industry and the fossil fuel industry, and the sort of juggernaut that we're on that's heading us to the extinction. So there's so much that could be done with that to frame it in a way that is clearly non-violent. And another thing, that a suggestion that came in as part of these ongoing conversations, which is really powerful and absolutely going to use, is that we can do things to help mitigate the risks that you're talking about, in terms of how it gets portrayed in the media and framed. Is so for some people like Valerie to do videos before they fly their drone, explaining why they're going to fly it. Ordinary people hanging up their laundry, going about their ordinary lives, saying, and this is what I'm called to do right now because this is the situation we're in. So those videos would then get released. For example, each time that person is arrested, they release that video. And so there's lots of things. These are just two examples of how we can kind of help to shape the narrative. We can't control the narrative, and ultimately we cannot self-censor our movement over fears of what the media may or may not do. We know that disruption will involve unpopularity and will involve us being labeled terrorists. We know those things from historical record.
Talking about disruption, in the 70s, when they had the miners' strikes, which went on for, I think it was like a month or something like that. It's a long, long time. And, you know, people, electricity was often cut off and so on. There were people who were seriously pissed off and wanted change, and they were totally radical. They didn't care what the population had to say. They knew what they needed, how they were being treated, and they were all out to fight back. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if you can equate the two, but there was a huge disruption there for the population because of what people believed to be right for their lives. And you know, at this point, we have so little time, and that's what we believe.
So just to pick up on the point March made about the David and Goliath symbology of drones versus the big, corporations, that's great. And we'll have XR as a small organization that isn't particularly popular in the mainstream media, trying to push that symbology out. And coming from the other direction, we're going to have the symbology of being aligned with drones. Items or vehicles are increasingly going to be viewed as weapons rather than toys as time goes by. There was an assassination attempt on Maduro recently with drones. There are drone attacks in the Middle East regularly. This is going to increase. It's going to be ever more apparent. And then we're going to try and shut down a major airport, as the media will say, using the threat of drones. And I know it's safe what you're proposing. I'm not arguing that it isn't. So on the one hand, we're going to try and control that symbology and that narrative. And on the other hand, we've got this massive media juggernaut that are going to be trying to do the opposite. And my fear is that we will lose.
So, yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think that's, I think it's really important to hear that fear and to recognize that it is a fear, and that we have to take risks as a movement. And if we listen to, I think it's really important we hear the fear, and I really value you sharing it and appreciate you sharing it. And if we only act on basis of those fears that come up when we're doing this work, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing. So just to recognize that, to name that in the room. And that's not to say we don't mitigate, and that's why it's important to hear them. And so, as I said, we can't control the narrative, but we never can. But we can do things that mitigate it. And when I first jumped on board with Extinction Rebellion in August last year, I was like, well, why would we launch on October the 3rd? Because I can't remember the details, but Brexit was about to be a big thing around Brexit was about to happen just after, when we were launching. And I was like, why would we launch then? Why wouldn't we wait until the spring? And I think Brexit has been a great example of, like, you could try and look into the future and mitigate fear or what could happen, could or couldn't happen. But at some point, it's kind of picking up on what Valerie is saying, at some point we have to stand like, this is an emergency, this is a crisis, this is the biggest news story of our times, this is the biggest challenge of our times. And on some level we have to be honest and appropriate to that. Telling the truth and acting as if it's real involves stepping up into that. And that's not to do that in an arrogant way, but it's just like, that's telling the truth. It's like, we're all on this call because we know that this is the challenge of our time. So to self-censor that, to co-opt our own potential to have impact as a movement, given what's at stake and the urgency, because of some fear of like, you might be right, and I can already tell that you're more keenly aware of the nature of drones and how they're going to be used in the future than I am, and so I really hear that, and I think it's valuable. And some people have touched on that, but I've not heard it explained as clearly and obviously well informed as you've just explained it. And I do really appreciate that, and I think therefore that says to me, okay, and is there any other ways we can mitigate for that? What, where is that? I don't intuitively at this point, after just hearing you say it, think that that's going to be. I think I would be very, very wary of us going, well, we can't do this action, therefore, because of that risk that you've just named. Because, as I said, because of the experience I've had with the Brexit and my concern around that, and it's like, actually on some level we have to. We do have an ability, we have agency in this, and we have a growing agency. And actually what's happening is that the planet has an agency, and that agency is also accelerating people's awareness of the crisis. So I would love to carry this conversation on with you around that specific thing and any other specific things, because I think there is something there, and I think it's valuable you're bringing that. I really want to hear it, and I want to respond to it in a way that isn't just me off the cuff in this conversation. So I'd really welcome that.
Great.
Okay. How are we? Can we live with me moving us on? Valerie, I just wrote in the chat that I muted you because your phone went off, but I can't unmute you. So if you want to speak, just unmute yourself. Do you want to say something now? Maybe wave your hand if you're burning to say something right now. Okay, you need to find the button then. It's just at the top. If you wiggle your mouse cursor over the video call window and then hit the mute button at the top, it'll unmute you. Okay, while you're trying to work out how to do that. There you go, great. Go ahead.
Oh, Dave, it's just because, this is such an emotional time for everybody. I think that this thing about being afraid, we all are afraid. We are afraid to shut down Heathrow. Well, I am anyway. I'm afraid to be arrested. But override, and I'm afraid if we lose the support of a lot of the population, a lot of people who maybe might have been on our side more if we didn't do this. But I am so afraid for the future, much, much, much more afraid for the future than I am for these things which I care about hugely, but not as much as I care about saving this planet. And I hope that if we go ahead and we manage to do this, that people will see that, we've done this. Maybe it wasn't the perfect thing to do, but the reason for doing it is so utterly valid and so incredibly important that, they can rally behind us, because if we manage to save a part of our lives in 20 years' time or so for the children, for this beautiful planet, we can manage to save something through Heathrow and other actions like that. Even if we suffer people not liking what we've done, then I think it's worth it in the long run. And I feel it's the right way to look at it, rather than worry about, because actually I think that the world is not made up. And I never thought that I would be doing something like this in my life. Never. But the world is not made up. And I've tried to figure out, why am I doing this? I sort of looking into myself, looking into my life and so on. Ultimately, what it boils down to is that I love this planet. I love my grandchildren. I love the children. I don't want to see people suffer like this. We know what happens when the world goes crazy, when wars and whatnot, how migrations, how people hurt each other and it all goes into a total catastrophe. This will be the worst of all catastrophes. And even if you think that Heathrow is not the perfect the perfect action, I think it's quite a powerful action. It could be. I think it's worth taking a risk with it. That's all I can say.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Okie dokie, we have been just over an hour now. So I think anyone who needs to leave, please do. But maybe we can just pop in a last couple of questions. We've covered a lot of ground there. I just wanted to quickly share this thing in case anyone else enjoys it as much as I have. Just earlier, we were touching a bit on how controversial ideas and people are kind of looked at later on, years or decades later. And this is from Information is Beautiful, which is a resource of amazing pieces of information beautifully presented. And it shows different people. Some of these are kind of household names, and their ideas that were very against the grain. They were considered radical at the time, and at the time they were often beaten and mocked or ridiculed or exiled. Some of them were killed. Galileo imprisoned, discredited, etc. and then what happened later. Many of their ideas adopted, and you know, I don't want to put this out of context, but I think it's just one interesting thing to sort of look at, the Wright brothers. Yeah, just a sort of creative view on looking back in history. Also, just to kind of bring a bit more kind of art in this, one of my favorite poets, Niyira Wahid, just wrote this poem, which I really love. The context of our different opinions when we're trying to keep together and stay together, because ultimately we're stronger and we do believe in enough of the same things. If we must both be right, we will lose each other.
Yeah.
And I think of this poem sometimes when I'm considering the amount of time that we're giving to conversations about what we disagree on inside XR and in activism, versus the amount of time we could be spending or balancing that with all the things that we do agree on, and the things we share, the fears, the dreams, the hopes. So again, I want to frame that not as in, you know, every wacky idea that comes along, let's just go with it without questioning it. I'm not suggesting that, but it's just one piece in there. Okay, so yeah, also just one other aspect I guess I would love to bring in, although I'm also trying to just sort of wear the facilitator hat, but I do have some feelings and thoughts I'd love to share, is also around just, this is a really big challenge to create a movement, or even, you know, especially a movement of movements, where we have very lofty, ambitious goals, and we're all trying to find our own place in working towards and contributing toward this ambitious common vision. There's a million and one reasons why that could fail, and why that's difficult. No one said it would be easy. And one of the hardest things I think in there is choosing to remain part of something when there's actions happening you don't completely agree with, and maybe sometimes you quite strongly disagree with. So I think there's a real profound question for each one of us who is stepping forward to be part of a large movement like this, to go, how much resilience do I have in this movement for diversity of worldview and opinion and approaches? We have such different ways of showing up, of communicating and seeing the world. And yeah, so I have a concern, I guess, around, yeah, how can we stay together, even when we sometimes disagree? Because I think it's the staying together that's so powerful, and the thing that enables us to really achieve the most beautiful, inspiring, impactful things. And we're only going to get it if we can be resilient in our disagreements. But there is this profound question, I think, of maybe the single most biggest challenge for a movement like XR, and also these independent action groups like this Heathrow drone action, and maybe there'll be more around. Yeah, we feel like we see something, to an extent, we feel like we see something that the general public is not seeing widely enough. There's a lot of people who don't, maybe they see a bit of it, but they're not fully facing or in touch with the immediacy, the severity of the issues we're responding to. And I have this really troubling image in my mind of a parent with their child, you know, who's just running towards a road, you know, a little bit oblivious, and you know, shouting or kind of just generally being very worked up as a parent with that child's best interests at heart. Obviously, it's, you know, XR is acting for the safety and protection of all ourselves and other species as well, not just on behalf of somebody else. And it's not suggesting that the general public are as oblivious as a child, but there is something there that is difficult, I think, where some people will see movements like Extinction Rebellion as you're disrupting and inconveniencing me, my flight, my journey somewhere. You're causing disruption that has a negative impact on me in the short term because you think you see something that I don't. Like, how dare you? Who do you think you are? I think it's a challenge to stay humble for activists working in that space. And yeah, I don't have a magical sort of solution or answer to that, but I feel like that needs to be acknowledged and recognized. in a conversation like this. Yeah, how do we have that right? So there's a bunch of questions. We're not going to have time for all of them. I want to shut up and hand back again to you guys. There's maybe quite a simple and specific one here, which we may have sort of touched on a bit already, but just it's the only one from Ian McIntyre. He is asking, are any women involved in this action? Hi, Valerie. If so, what percentage? Because I'm concerned that it could come across a warlike macho action, and that acting en masse with our bodies is more effective. And yeah, I'm particularly interested in that latter part as well, around yeah, using ourselves as the disruptive tool. And we've covered already the power of a drone, but got me fantasizing about whether we could somehow, you know, have people lifting themselves off on little jetpacks or something. But yeah, I'll hand over.
Well, can I say, I think this last week, Roger was out campaigning, and Lars, you can correct me, I'm usually getting facts wrong, but I think he signed up of 50 women in their, quite a lot of women anyway, in their 50s signed up for Heathrow. And I've also been making phone calls to people because I'm working more with the outreach. And I've been phoning people just to check, you know, how they feel, if they're still on board and so on. And a lot of the people are women. Yes, women are getting on board. Well, we would, wouldn't we? We are mothers. You know, not that you're not fathers, but, you know, we are mothers. So we live all our lives to look after our children, now more than ever. Yeah.
Thank you, Valerie. Yeah, and just to pick up on that, like for example, when we use the 20 with it, there's an idea potentially of having, say, 20 people who are going to fly the drones to launch videos, or it might be that everyone who flies a drone does a video. But if we're very conscious that the first videos that we release, and if maybe it will be 20. And that we really use people like Valerie that help to kind of show the diversity of our movement, a broader movement. I'm not talking about Extinction Rebellion because it's not an Extinction Rebellion action, but the broader movement that is rising up on this emergency and of this action specifically. So we would absolutely, the aim of those videos would be to, like, the reason suggestion is something like everyday things like hanging up laundry, is that it's everyday activities. It's not macho, it's not violent, it's like ordinary people, and as Valerie says, that the probably the single biggest demographic, we have people from every age and every, you know, background, but the biggest demographic is women 50 plus, that, you know, that they seem to be stepping up in large numbers. So it's absolutely not about boys with their toys, which I think some people have had that fear around this action, but it's absolutely not. And we will be working very hard to ensure that it's not portrayed as that, as best we can, you know, to mitigate for that as best we can.
Cool, thank you. Great, and you've just also reminded me, yeah, I wanted to add just one other last little thing onto my previous piece, which is around, I think it's so easy to criticize other people's ideas when you're working together on a project or in a movement. And it's so much harder to offer a better alternative. And I would love to hear from some of the people who are more critical about this idea, some alternatives. And I've heard some, and I wonder if you've heard some, Larch, or any of you guys. I've heard some, I mean, I've heard things about blocking roads going into airports, and could Heathrow be blocked in that way? I wanted to just open a space for any alternative ideas you've heard, and what you think of them, if any come to mind.
Well, I'd love to comment on that, yeah, and I don't even necessarily, well, okay, how I was seeing it before when we were working within the framework of XR in this proposal was that it wasn't an either or, but it was a both and. But maybe now, yes, it, in a sense. Although I personally, this is my personal opinion, think it's a shame that this action isn't part of XR, and I think it's it's not optimal as a movement, that we haven't been able to have the conversation like this in this kind of way where it's worked, and that's fine. It's obviously however it is, and I do see an advantage. There's two advantages that are obvious to me. One is that, in a way, by it being an independent action, it mitigates for some of the risks that Dave spoke to about how it's portrayed. It's like, well, it's not going to reflect on XR, or it's mitigating the risk of it reflecting on XR, and there's things we can do around that to, so that's one thing. The other is that it opens up for a smaller group of people to do this action in a freer way. So actually we don't have to try and include a mass action to make sure that the mass side is catered for, so like the mass picnic and that, but other ideas absolutely that have been talked about that really would fit with this action, if people wanted to contribute those to it, would be things that have been talked about, like doing a toilet occupation, so occupying all the toilets in the airport, and there's nothing to stop with someone going ahead and doing that. That's a great action, could be done at any time. A few people being willing to be arrested for sitting in the toilet all day, and if we coordinated that, they'd probably close the airport because they've got no loos. You could do swarming and stop people getting to the airport. You could do roadblocks to stop people getting to the airports. Those are some people talked about, going up, booking on flights, but or not taking up time in the queues, so that you just can't get through and process the, doing some sort of action, die-in or whatever in the airport to slow things down, to jam it up. A mass occupation of the runway, cutting in a very open way, cutting the fences and occupying the runway. Then there's another one of like using technology to kind of jam the booking processes or whatever. So all of these things have been talked about. All of them potentially. I'm not so sure about the jamming one, because in my mind there's a real importance of openness and accountability. But nonetheless, potentially those kind of actions have all got a role to play, and there's absolutely nothing stopping someone or groups or affinity groups, whatever, going ahead and organising those as long as they're done in a non-violent, self-sacrificial, respectful way. And another example is that's come up a lot is City Airport. Why not City Airport rather than Heathrow? Well, and they put the arguments of, well, there's more, disproportionately more of those wealthy 15% of the 70% of flyers are at City Airport rather than Heathrow, and that's true. But there's nothing stopping someone organising that. Go ahead and organise it. And the beauty of this action is it's relatively easy potentially to organise and keep safe, and for a small number to do it. But equally, any of those other options or combinations of those options could be used at City Airport. There's nothing stopping someone to do that. My practice of telling the truth and acting as if it's real means I really have to look at all of the evidence that I have before me and what's the best use of my time. And that leads me to conclude very clearly that Heathrow is of a different scale of disruption than City Airport. If we shut down City Airport for 2 weeks, it would have an impact, but it wouldn't have anywhere near the same level of impact as Heathrow. Those wealthy people would just, instead of chartering their own plane, because City Airport shut down, they'd just go first class from Heathrow or Gatwick. So I think, and Heathrow is a major piece of infrastructure. It's a flagship project. It's got every reason why it for me is the most valuable, beneficial target for us at this point. And I'm happy to have explain more about that. But for me, I'm really clear on that. Just the cold analysis of the data. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I would love to, thank you so much for that. I'd love to kind of bring this together and conclude with one of the most important questions, I think, around what can we learn this to take forward. And that's a large question. I would like to sort of particularly position that within Extinction Rebellion. Like, what would have been a better process? How can we do this better in future? Should XR UK do any actions? If so, how? If not, then how can it support actions being done? And I'd love to gather some thoughts on that. Maybe I can share just some latest kind of thinkings just here. I don't know how much sense they'll make. I'm just going to spend like less than a minute on this, I think. But this is just one idea, for example, that I was having. Might be completely different to what you guys are thinking. But perhaps ideas for non-violent direct actions, civil disobedience, could come and be checked against XR. This, I guess, I'm framing this within XR UK, which I'm most involved in, I guess. You know, and check these action ideas against alignment against the 10 principles. And obviously, this has happened with this action, but there'd be a bit more clarity to this process. And maybe only the actions that score sort of 80 to 100% on that would be official XR UK actions and get the full money and messaging and support. But ones that score quite highly, like sort of 60, 80%, could get you know, support and celebration from media and messaging, and ones that are much more controversial and don't score so highly on the alignment check, which I'm just pulling this out of my arse really, but let's say, for example, that the original version 1 Heathrow drone action was like 60% or 50% or something on the alignment check, let's just say, would have like no XR UK response. The adapted version 2 that integrates some of the concerns could be higher. So maybe XR that couldn't be done under the XR name, let's say, but it would be agreed that, you know, media and messaging could support it. And then these ones that are like very much against the alignment check, if people were doing actions like that, like I've kind of half jokingly put in blow up Parliament, but people with XR banners, right? Like that might be an example when XR UK would actually step in and go, hang on a second, this is totally against our values and principles. We have to denounce this. So yeah, I've dived a little bit into a bit of a loot flag idea there, and feel free to respond to that or ignore it and just go along with your own thoughts. But I'm just interested, basically, what ideas can we come up with now to kind of avoid this kind of painful, resource draining, quite divisive situation coming up in future, where we can, you know, encourage weird and wonderful imaginative ideas for actions and not drag everybody into a kind of consensus finding rabbit hole. Yeah, hopefully I framed that.
Do you want to go first, Valerie? Yeah, because I've got quite a lot to say. You go first, and then I can.
I'll be very quick. I mean, I hope I'm not, you know, going to say something horribly controversial, but just taking Brexit, to my mind, I felt that, you know, the government put a referendum to the people, and people were not qualified. They didn't know enough. I mean, some people knew how it affected them personally, but it had to be a much broader picture than that. And so a referendum was put to the people, and it seems like it's been very chaotic ever since, you know, trying to get everybody to agree. Whereas you hope that the government were the experts, you know, who had the information and talking to Brussels and so on, and could decide, you know, what was the right thing to do. Or at least, anyway, going back, maybe that's not the same thing. I think that it's so difficult, this question, because not everybody can get up and do big actions. Not everyone can do that. We can all, you know, block roads and do all those kinds of things. And I mean, mothers and parents come with their children, children come with their parents, and it all works really well. Some people get arrested, they get, you know, let out, and so on. But maybe you can only go so far with trying to convince the government to change their attitude with those kind. I mean, it's made a big impact already. But when you want to make an even bigger impact on the government, to really force them into a corner, maybe only a few people can take those kinds of actions. So to expect tons of people to agree to something like that, which would be absolutely wonderful, but maybe that's not something that can happen. So it has to happen, given also the time frame for the destruction of this planet. I think maybe a few people have to take the actions that they feel are right. I mean, obviously, hopefully nobody's going to start a bomb to themselves and go and blow up other people or anything horrendous like that. But always within the XR policies of non-violence and so on. Maybe just take a few people who can be that radical. But I hope that is kind of answering that question. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm aware I've got lots I'd like to say about this. Dave, do you have anything you want to add to that question?
Yeah, I guess what I would add, I think it ties in quite nicely with exactly how actions that aren't associated with that XR disassociate themselves. So there comes a point when we're talking about this scale where it's not really now, acceptable, or XR is basically saying this is not something that we want to condone or support, or denounce. I'm just aware that this entire conversation, we've accidentally and frequently slipped back into talking about it in the context of XR, even though it's an independent action. And I think that highlights how hard it's going to be, other than just providing the technicality that this is independent, a little bit like the Euro election stuff. I think just trying to get beyond just presenting that technicality so that it's actually received as fact that it's a separate group. So I think it ties in nicely with that. It's about how exactly will that be done in an effective manner.
Yeah, I think that is a good question. We talked about having a separate website and a separate logo and a separate team, basically, or teams to deliver the action. So I think we need to think carefully, and we're in communication with media and messaging within Extinction Rebellion, and so I think we have to keep that communication going with them, because I think they've got that's their kind of mandate, if you like, to have a better sense of that. So I think we need to make informed decisions about that and keep that conversation going to make sure it is separate and it's seen as separate. I think that and recognizing that that's going to be challenging, and that we actually have to actively work at that. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a really important thing, and it is very easy to slip. So I think we have to kind of really be, especially I'm full-time with XR and have been, and this action's come out of that process. And as I said, I think also naming the fact that for me personally, I feel like it should be. That's where it lives in my heart, in my sense, and so I have to really maybe do some of that work to go, it's not that, and respect that, and really take that on board. And so I just kind of to name that for myself personally, I guess. But just to and so maybe again, it's partly these conversations and to keep that going. So yeah, that's part of it. But so the other, in terms of what we could do better going forward, so with XR hat on, because it's totally separate from the Heathrow action, which we're just talking about. I think how we can learn from it is a whole range of things. So first of all, to recognize where this whole, in terms of the Heathrow action proposal, where that came from was this vacuum that existed. We made a mistake, which is that we had as a movement, we made a mistake. Extinction Rebellion UK, we had a strategy going into April. We didn't set a clear process of okay, and then 2 weeks after the end of it, we'll start a period of debrief, and then a week after that we'll set a period of debrief and then strategy development. We didn't do that. We made a mistake. So we had 3 months of vacuum of no nationally agreed strategy. So in that vacuum, in that absence, political circle, action circle, and movement circle were all trying to do their mandate, do their stuff without that clear agreed strategy. And so this action came in from that place. So that was part of the problem, because then for a long time it's is it one of the tensions was, is it aligned with the strategy or not? Well, we don't have a clear strategy. It's action circle, best guess at what our strategy should be, and the kind of working model of a strategy that we're working to. Based on April, it's yes, we're moving towards October. and we've got a series of actions in the build-up. So that was the broad theory of like, okay, this is what we worked to before. Presumably we will be doing the same sort of model again because it worked. So what would those actions in the build-up look like? We didn't have any at that point, you know, when we're trying to develop them. Project Mushroom came through, which was brilliant, but this was part of that. So I think one of the things we can do, and we are actively doing now in the UK and internationally, and I really hope we do it proactively and get some really positive stuff done on this, is to create a clearer pathway to developing strategy, to debriefing after major action, to locking that in. There's the time when we debrief, and we're going to do it, and these people are going to oversee it and make sure it happens, and we're all crew, we're all going to take responsibility for making that prioritized, that we debrief and we feed into strategy, and that we use this time now to sort of have a broad strategy which is then tweaked with informed by the debrief after October, you know, and you know, so I think that's a key part of it. And also setting, as part of that process over the next few months, is setting or agreeing the date for whatever happens in the spring, and it may well be April, but we don't know. There's this, you know, Fridays for a Future, Greenpeace, 350.org. We by 2020 we rise. You know, all of these are having those same conversations, and we're having it together, and we need to kind of get that work done over the next few months to really help with that. So those are two things, you know, the strategy development and the process of those conversations and the setting the dates that we can do. I think a broader thing, which speaks to some of the problems we've had since October and probably before, is as a movement stepping up to have that maturity individually and collectively to give feedback in a way that's like not dumping on the people, you know. So a process for individually and collectively taking on ideas, developing ideas, you know, and giving feedback in a way that's really healthy, empowering, and in alignment with our principles and values, you know, that's optimal in terms of how we help our movement go forward optimally. I think that's really key. I think part of that is the personal practice of getting the support we need. We had this guy called Jamie Cato who came and did 3 days of work with us a little while back, and he's helping to offer a 1 day face-to-face and a 1 day online training every month for people around that, and I think we can all use our own support around that, but I think as XR we can bring in people like him to support ourselves to do that work so that we can be more effective in giving the gems that we've all got rather than the dumping. And we can also do more within the action circle, creating feedback as a team or a circle to help hold and garner the feedback on ideas. I think that could be good, because at the moment it's been patchy, and it's often been the people trying to develop the ideas that are getting the feedback, and they're not really got the capacity for it, and they're getting dumped on, you know. So I think there's a lot we can do to improve that. I know, so those are some obvious things for me. So this broader process of strategy development and setting dates, so that we've got a framework that we're working in, and then there's this team and structure around feedback and the personal practice around feedback. I think those are tangible things we can do, and I think they're really important. We've also got a clearer process for strategy development, I mean for action development, so that there is now a proposal. So basically, if you want to do a local action in the UK or an affinity group action, then that's fine. With your principle of autonomy and decentralization, it's aligned with the principles and values, and in support of the 3 demands, you can get on and do it. I think it's different when it's a national action requiring national resources and national input. It has national significance. And so I think maybe there's some more work we could do around clarifying that, like what makes it one or the other. I mean, one bit of feedback I got last week, which really helped me understand why, you know, this action is like that. It's a sort of, because it's Heathrow, it's a, you know, it's an icon, it's a global icon. So it's like whatever, even if an affinity group did an action on Heathrow, if it was a big impact action, like it shut down the whole of Heathrow, it would have it would be an internationally significant action, even if it was just 8 people doing something. A bit like the affinity group, 2 affinity groups that did the naked action on Parliament. That was just 2 affinity groups doing an action, and they didn't have or need input from the wider movement. And that's a great example of the autonomy and decentralizing practice. But that was all a nationally important action, you know. So it's like there are these grey areas, and I think the more we can set guidance and kind of have conversations around how we handle that, the better. And I think those are conversations that we still need. I know, for example, Luke, you know, last time we spoke, you had this idea of we don't need national actions. We can just have affinity groups, and the national kind of resources go to support those locally generated or affinity group generated ideas. And that could work, but it only gets us so far. At some point, we needed a process of saying, you know, where does this fit in? If it's, where does it, you know, and who decides and how do we decide? So what we need there is transparency. And one of the things that went wrong with this action and proposal process was that we didn't initially have a process for doing that was so clear, and then we got one, and so the action tried to follow that, but maybe that wasn't communicated clearly enough. And so I think, you know, it's just like there is at the moment a process for proposing a national action, and that's the process we've got. So I think if we all agree with this principle of a self-organizing system and autonomy and decentralization within agreed mandates, then we need to get behind that. And I think one of the problems is, as a movement, we haven't had that. The self-organizing system hasn't worked because people that have had those mandates have not been free to get on with them. They've had people saying, hang on, I don't trust you. And it relies trust, you know, and so I think there's more work to do around like making sure everyone's communicated clearly around what the basis on which we're all working. And so when we've got this proposal, that everyone can see that and everyone can change it, like feed in to say, okay, it needs tweaking or whatever, and that can happen. Like no one, and I'm not attached to it, that proposal process looking a certain way. I didn't even develop it. But I think what we need is a clear one, you know, that everyone, you know, it's good in that everyone either loves it or at least it's good enough for us to get on with until we can improve it, you know. So those are kind of my initial thoughts, that what we can learn from this and how we can go forward.
Amazing. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I would like to wrap up, and in doing so, I think just invite each of us to say a kind of final couple of sentences, and maybe takeaways, anything brief that you think would kind of help us to conclude. Yeah, so anyone who's ready, I would welcome to do that, and we'll try and be done by 5 p.m. UK time.
Okay, I'm happy to start. So I really appreciate this conversation, really do. It's I think we could probably do this sort of thing more, so everyone can understand each other. I understand a lot of the points that have been made, and I would like to reiterate that the plan as written, I do believe is safe. I just have this differing opinion about what constitutes violent and non-violent. You know, I think perhaps where we're differing is the action non-violent? Yes, it is, because no one's going to get hurt. Is the perception of the action non-violent? In my view, still no, because in my view, drones will come to be seen as being weapons, and brandishing an empty gun around is not, in my view, non-violent. But that is very much my view. Obviously, now it's going to be done as an independent action. And so, again, I think it's, I would appreciate, obviously, and I know you will do this, a lot of thought going into how that will be actually created as an independent movement or action, rather than just technicality saying, oh, we're independent, but everything about it looking like actually it's XR. But I have faith that all of this is being thought about. So, yeah, cheers.
Thank you.
I think it's wonderful to talk to you, Dave, and I'm sure when we next get together, everything that you've said will be discussed with other people as well. I'm not a professional kind of activist, as I said at the very beginning, and I'm not always very good at framing, my responses in a way that perhaps sort of diplomatic. I just speak from the heart. I've had to work from the heart for this. I've had to do a crash course in, facing up to the terrible, terrible deeds of, governments and corporations and so on. So that's how I operate. I feel somehow, though, in all the world, because we're talking billions of people, to stand up against the terrible things that have happened knowingly. It takes people like me who perhaps are not as, well educated, perhaps not so well informed, but we know what's going on just as much as you all do, and we're ready to fight and to stand up for what we believe in. But everything you said has been great. It's given me, lots of food for thought. So yeah, we'll take it on board and talk about it. And thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you both. Yeah, and I really appreciate the conversation as well. And I guess one thing I would say is just Dave and anyone else that's got views on this is that we're all crew. That's like, just as tell the truth and act as if it's real is a core to our movement. I think that we're all crew is also. And so, what it's not just feedback is vital, and giving feedback is a vital thing. And wherever possible, the people giving that feedback that have an insight into a particular area, it would be great if they can help us. Like, it's not just like, I've been in movements for the last 30 years where people like to sit on the sidelines and wag their fingers and go, you don't want to do it like that, you want to do it like this. And clearly that's not the movement we've created. It's not going to work on that basis. That's not to say that feedback on its own isn't a valuable thing. It is. And my invitation is to help us, if you can, to whatever level you're able or inspired to help. There's an openness here to work with us to make sure those points you're concerned about and raising around the future drone perceptions and the public perceptions and the sort of imagery stuff. And, there was another point that you raised as well. I can't remember it offhand, but to help see how we can improve that and how we can do that. The separation between XR and this action. That was the other one. Thank you. Any input, suggestions, guidance you've got on that? You want to be part of the team that's creating this action so that you can sit on the meetings and chip in those perspectives. Whatever you're willing to give, it would be really welcome, and I see it would really help to make this action better, because that's all any of us want, is to be as effective as we can be in this time of crisis. So that's the bottom line, really, is like there's this for me, this absolute openness. I'm here in service, and I see that that's true probably for all of us on this call. We're here in service to this greater thing, and however that looks, and I think that's the thing that will hold our movement together. If we're here in that open service, that then we know that we're all, we all make mistakes, and we can be compassionate with ourselves and with each other in this process, and we'll have differences on different aspects of it, but fundamentally we're here in service, and let's work together to do the best we can in these desperate times.
Amen. I'm hugely appreciative to all you three joining, and everybody who's been with us, although we can't see or hear you other than your questions you've been typing. I've tried my best to bring them in, and thank you. And anyone who watches this after today, hello, and thanks for your time as well and your openness. I think just my wishes going forward, my hopes and dreams are around all of us just recognizing how challenging this is and will continue to be, to wrestle with finding how to bring our gift to this hugely ambitious goal of this project. If we can succeed in going most of the way to, let alone all of the way to achieving these demands and the world that we want to create, where we're living in harmony, more or less, with the living systems upon which we depend, and doing so in a way that is just, will be such a beautiful thing. I would love to look back on having met that challenge with an open mind, effectiveness and grace. And I just really hope that we can contribute in more ways than only criticizing, as you say, Larch, because a criticism can be so incredibly helpful and bring some insight from our blind spots, and we need to create space for that. And there is so much work. I want to reassure anyone who's not plugged into the beating heart of at least talking about XR UK, which I recognize I'm bringing it back to a lot, because that's just where I'm largely coming from. There is so much work being done to improve systems, to improve communication and feedback. We're really such a young movement, and the individuals in it are even newer. So if we can just stay together long enough for some of these brilliant ideas and improvements to grow their roots and to blossom, I think things are only going to get more fair, more effective, and more collaborative in a way that's really enabling. And so I hope we can last that long. And this call has been one piece of that. So thank you again all for joining.
Thank you so much.
And I hope you have a lovely evening.
Yeah,
Thank you, Luke.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Look, I thought you were just a technical person, but it sounds like you're sort of, you know, evangelical preacher and all sorts of things rolled
None
into
of us are just anything.
Lars, thank you. Dave, thank you. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everyone, joining.